I've seen and managed multiple people where it felt like the work was going into a black box. And even if they enjoy, say, the writing and executing of the code on a day-to-day basis, the learning of new packages, the little things, right, that make the job worthwhile, they ultimately become unmotivated to do anything extra. It's amazing how it crumbles. Like I read about a study where they had people build something with Lego blocks. After they finished building, the researcher came and just like sort of destroyed it and then just put it there. And they wanted to see if people would rebuild or build something new. And it actually very quickly destroyed the intrinsic motivation to build these things.
Interesting.
Yeah, I hope I'm remembering that right. But I was like, wow, yep, I've seen this in work. I've seen this in work more times.
Someone fact check us, please.
Yeah.
Richad, welcome back to the Ken's Nearest Neighbors podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
Excellent. Well,
welcome to my home.
Yeah, thank you. So for those that don't know, we're recording this in Richad's beautiful home here in New York. And so I'm grateful you let me come hang out, and I'm really happy we could do this because your last episode with me was one of the most popular. You were talking about sort of how you progressed through your career so quickly. And I'm excited to pick up where we left off, talk about some other exciting things, other things we have in common. Obviously, we talked a lot about cooking and and anthropology and history. And so I'm really interested to dive into those as well. So
it's the ranging topics outside of data science when you can relate them back that I think bring the most interest for me now.
Yeah.
Rather than just directly studying data science, broadly speaking. So excited to get into it.
Yeah, well, one of the really, really cool things I think we both see is that there are so many things in our outside lives where we see parallels with our careers. And it sort of all comes full circle in the end, right? And I'm excited to get into some of those topics with you. So maybe since we talked last, I'd love for you to catch me up with what's going on with you, what's going on with your career. Has anything interesting changed or happened since then?
Yep. So last time on your podcast, I was talking about how I'd turned things around at work. And now I have left that job, actually. I left in mid-March, early April. And, well, there were a lot of things that went into that decision. Some of it came down to, I guess, a lack of strategic priority for data science. It just wasn't necessarily particularly central to what the organization did. And I've realized that as data science is expensive, it is high risk because it's research. You don't know if you're going to, any specific exploration, you don't know what's going to happen. It felt like climbing and fighting an uphill battle. And so, I would have rather been in a place where data science felt like it was really central to the purpose. Like there was C-suite buy-in to what we were doing. There was broad consensus about the ways that data science could add value. Yeah, it sort of felt in many ways like I was doing it alone.
Yeah. I think that's something a lot of people don't realize is that, businesses are very excited. Oh, we need to hire these data teams. We need to do all this stuff. But once you get in a lot of these meetings, it's all like, hey, what's the return on investment? We're spending all this money on data science. What are we getting out of it? And unfortunately, that isn't necessarily how data science works. Is the expected return on projects, it can have a massive deviation. And you can try to scope it, you can try to do these things, but you can't really start to evaluate things until you have some semblance of where the analysis is going, what it's looking like after running some models, after doing some actual work. And so it gets really hard from what I've seen and from what I've experienced to essentially lobby for money for your data science projects, to lobby for team members or lobby to really grow that program, especially when you have to do the work before you can show what you're going to return on it. And that to me is one of the single largest problems in the data domain. How do you feel about that? Is that something you see as well?
I agree. Yes, it's the ultimate catch-22. Yeah, you don't know what the result will be. And then when you're hired, when the hire is made in a very general, this is like the next stage and we need to do this, without necessarily understanding what the use cases are. Part of the reason I was hired was to bring an understanding of those use cases. In that case, what made it difficult was getting access to the people we'd be serving, the customers, so to speak. Just because of the way the organization was set up, it ended up being extremely challenging to get in front of them. We were a shared service organization for Blackstone. So we were serving their global real estate portfolio. And so what that means is anything that can be centralized logically would be centralized with Revantage. So if you're buying like a new real estate assets, new $500 million worth of commercial real estate from in a portfolio for an investment, then instead of them doing all of their own functions like HR, accounting, finance, whatever, and fulfilling whatever Blackstone needs for reporting and such, a lot of that would go to Revantage. And so a lot of these companies grew. They had different cultures when they come in. When you buy them, anyone in PE or will understand this. You buy these organizations, they have different cultures. They rose in different ways, and some of them didn't really want to work with us. So it's like if you were forced to buy something that you didn't want to buy, and then there are the parts that are required that you're forced to do. And then there's me being like, hey, want to spend more money with us? We're doing cool data science, Yeah. It's real estate. It's not the most tech forward industry in the world. So a lot of times they're like, well, we're good. We already do business. Oftentimes I wouldn't even get to that stage. I'd be sort of blocked from reaching them directly. So without direct access to customers, it was like, how am I supposed to incept, come up with what their biggest problems are and do those things, and then iterate and get to real projects that produce real value. Yeah.
It's funny. Well, it's also sad. It's more sad than funny. Most of the data scientists who I talk to who have left jobs or started looking for new jobs, there's two main things that I've heard over and over again. It's one, I don't feel like I'm making an impact. I don't feel like the company's invested in the success of these programs or the teams, or it's that, I'm not growing, I'm not learning. And those are two really important things. It's almost never, we have too much work.
Yeah, it's never that.
And no. that's the funny thing is, I really believe that companies that embrace data, they see the returns, and they're going to be so far down the road compared to others that are in the same industry, in the same space. But they have to be willing to accept risk. When you look at OpenAI and their success now, they were building a product without any idea what the use cases were. I mean, there's some semblance of the idea, but hey, we're going to advance this technology as far as we can, and we know that there will be opportunities to monetize it. That's an unbelievably inefficient business model. And of course, they have a lot of funding. They have a lot of these things, but there's power in doing that, power in creating that autonomy and that sort of creative side within an organization, because I view data science projects a little bit like venture capital, right? You have a portfolio of projects, and one of those projects, two of those projects is going to kill it. And they're going to make up for all the projects that fail. Because there are inevitably going to be projects that you spin up, you're like, hey, we thought this would have a lot of impact, and it just didn't. Like the results, the information isn't there. As you have better teams, you have better data infrastructure, a lot of these things, you can figure out and iterate on those things really quickly. But especially when starting up, you have to give these teams sort of a looser rope, because they're not going to be able to create traction. They're not going to be able to get any of these wins if you're just being scrutinized all the time. And from a business practitioner perspective, I own and operate a couple of businesses. It's like a really difficult thing to do. You're like, oh, we have these dollars and I could allocate them to something that I know will return. But it is, we talk about risk appetite. That's something that is also a factor.
There are a lot of techniques you can use, which I guess I've learned or come up with in the trenches to define the risk appetite. So some suggestions I've seen. So I kind of break the data science lifecycle into sizing of opportunities, the research phase where you're like, oh, will this work or not? You try to prove the concept. And then there's the sort of post-research, like the deployment and the monitoring and all that, the retraining and that stuff. The research part, the sizing tends to get skipped over the most. and that sets up the research side to fail. So one thing you can do is so one technique that I used, I called it sort of insight driven development. So this is if you're in the research phase of a data science project, and you every 2 weeks you meet with the stakeholder, something like that. You at the end of 2 weeks, you want to be able to say what you learned, and you want to deliver an insight that you think might be useful to them, at the very least interesting to them, and that will stoke discussion about what to do next. So then they feel like they've contributed something to what you're doing rather than the black box. Research suffers from the black box problem where the data scientist retreats into the little cave to do their thing, and stakeholders are like, what's happening? And then the sprint ends, and you don't have any, you just have research results. You're like, oh, the AUC was this and that, and then they're like, oh, okay, but so when are we going to get our app, Yeah, so that's one technique I use. It doesn't work in isolation. I learned I applied this a lot, and I learned the limitations of it. One, it makes it makes getting to the prediction stuff a little slower sometimes. But it does lead to a richer discussion, but it can be a little more ambulatory, kind of wandering, right? I would say a better approach would be to do that while you're in the research phase, but to actually start with a very defined sizing phase where you consider many opportunities. I think you should consider 20 plus. And if that sounds hard, that's kind of the point, because it's like brainstorming for writing, you want to come up with a lot of ideas, be able to see connections between them. These 5 suck, but maybe 17 and 4. Hey, wait, what if we come, if you do that, the more you brainstorm, the better the ideas will be. And then you remove them later. And then you go through deeper sizing, meaning what is the potential ROI if this works? How much time is saved? How much cost is saved? How much new revenue might we generate? Will customers really care about this new capability? The GPT angle, which took that really to the extreme. And then you go over that with the stakeholders, and then you say, okay, if we did this for X amount of time, and if in 6 months, 3 months, and all we had at the end was, well, our results aren't quite good enough, but we know this stuff, would that be okay? I found time boxing research to be very arbitrary. If you don't size the ROI of success, and you don't size the benefit of failure, the learnings from failure, the insights that come out of it, that's, I think, the key part. So you try to set yourself up to minimize the risk of failure of research. And I think that's an effective general principle and approach to use, especially in enterprises when you're trying to transform a business, as opposed to something where it's an AI first business and the use case is very clear, like self-driving cars, for example. Yeah. I feel like a lot of the material targeted at enterprise data science is kind of, I don't know, it sounds like buzzwords to anyone who does data science, but I feel like if we make it concrete, you could just unlock so much value in businesses. It'd be crazy.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're describing, I don't know whether it's necessarily push or pull, but in your role, you're defining the data science objectives. Mm-hmm. In a lot of organizations, it's the teams that are saying, hey, we have this problem, and throwing it to the data teams. Mm-hmm. Is that something you think that shows up organizationally? Is that a design choice that companies have made? It's that we're going to leverage the data teams to solve we're going to ask about these specific problems, or the data teams, it's their job to elicit those problems and figure out where they can create value? Or is there a little bit of that in all organizations? There's some of this push and pull, right?
There's always some of both. With me personally, from my very first job as a data research analyst, I've had to come up with my own work. And that's because no one knew what to do with me. So it gave me when I look back, it gave me really good experience figuring out how to be valuable, which is a useful skill anywhere. And then if you do that successfully, people look at what you're doing like, wow, they take so much ownership. It works at any level of job you're in, whether you're entry level or not. So yeah, in my first job and in the one I just left, there was a lot of me figuring out. Often what can happen is a cycle where you figure out something, you sort of throw it out into the world with as much knowledge and contact with potential customers and clients as you can manage in the time frame. Some people see it, some of them pick it up. They're like, oh, okay, all right, cool. Actually, I want this. And so then you get the pull. So you push to generate pull. Kind of like, you give away a free product to generate the pull of they'll buy more, like in a supermarket or something. I feel like consulting firms know this, so they generate business through relationships, obviously, but through, the reports they write and, oh, okay, these guys must be pretty smart. Let's hire them, So I am used to pushing first. In my second job, my boss actually really understood data science at Greystone. He liked to work with it and dabble in it too. And it was like a startup like team. We were building an app. And so it was much easier to come up with real ways to add value with data science quickly. So I do kind of miss that feeling sometimes. Like, wow, I did something and a week later it had an impact and we acted on the insight that I came up with this or this, or this other thing, or we modeled the data. It was very like the action feedback loop was really fast.
Yeah.
And I feel like data scientist enterprises, they don't get that as much. And that's a challenge. And one of the challenges of leaders like me is to actually be able to structure projects in a way to create that loop, the success loop that makes people motivated to keep going.
Yeah. Personally, that's something that I cannot work without. If I don't see the output of my work, it's really difficult for me to motivate to do anything. And I mean, that's probably why I work in the roles I work now. It's probably why I make YouTube videos, is because I see the return on my work immediately when I make a video. I publish it, I see people watch it, I get people commenting on it. I say, okay, I get feedback, some of it negative, some of it positive, and it's okay, I can iterate, I can use this, I can push this into the next thing that I do. The hardest thing for me is when I feel like whatever I did, it just went into a black box, or the people that I made it for didn't care about it as much as I cared about it. And that is a real struggle. And I think that's essentially the job that you described of a lot of data science leaders is, how do we make this work? How do we value the work in the same way the data scientists value the work?
It's a sinking feeling to create something and throw it into a black box. I've seen and managed multiple people where it felt like the work was going into a black box. And even if they enjoy the execution, say the writing and executing of the code on a day-to-day basis, the learning of new packages, the little things, right, that make the job worthwhile, they ultimately become unmotivated to do anything extra. It's amazing how it crumbles. It's like I read about a study where they had people build something with Lego blocks, and after they finished building, the researcher came and just like sort of destroyed it and then just put it there, and they wanted to see if people would rebuild or build something new, and it actually very quickly destroyed the intrinsic motivation to build these things.
Interesting.
Yeah, I hope I'm remembering that right, but I was like, wow, yep, I've seen this in work.
Someone
more times.
fact check us, please.
Yeah,
but that's fascinating to me, because I don't know if other data professions necessarily face that same issue. So you have data engineers, if you're building pipelines, you're making queries, whatever it might be. The end result of that is you have a new table, you have a new essentially pipeline that is probably going to be used at least by someone. If you have even like a machine learning engineer, they're creating an API endpoint, they're creating some form of infrastructure that's used and resilient. You have a software engineer. If you have like a web developer, you have, oh, we made this new button. Maybe it's not the most impressive button, or it's not meaningful to me, but I see it on the website. We made this and we implemented it. I would imagine data scientists, data analysts probably have one of the higher percentages of work that's done and just sort of thrown out.
Yep.
And
yeah. Why do you think so many people are leaving data science to do data engineering? It's like a trend, right? It's not just because of salaries, or just because of salaries. It's not just because the hype cycle is ending and now data engineering. It's more, I think that people get into it, and because of the lack of infrastructure, they find it annoying, and then they end up moving to that side of the value chain, like the data engineering side. So then But then ultimately, for example, I could have done that. You know, I know what it feels like to build awesome little apps and tools and stuff, and the feeling that you get when people use it, it's very nice, right? And research sometimes doesn't get that, but I still get off more on the research. Yeah. When you find something really interesting, you're like, wow, that really performing, or wow, that little change, or yeah. For me, it's like the thrill of discovery. So it's either the thrill of your stuff being used, all the other engineering, or the thrill of the discovery of the thing itself. It feels like you're discovering something new about the universe. I don't know, almost like a little chunk of the universe. And I think those people, if they have successful careers and they like what they're doing, those are the ones who stay in data science. Yeah.
That makes sense. I also think data scientists are generally problem solvers. We want answers. We want efficiency. We want an output. And one of the reasons why many data scientists go to data engineering is because they see all of the problems upstream of what they're doing, upstream of what they're doing. And they say, hey, I just want to fix this. I'm going to go over here because that's where all the problems are. I can't solve my problems without this prerequisite problem being solved. And maybe that's a good thing, because I think data quality and infrastructure comes before analysis. But it's also somewhat of an unfortunate thing that so many companies have so many things wrong with their data infrastructure.
I'd like to take a quick second to thank one of our sponsors, Pathrise. Job hunting can be daunting, particularly in today's unpredictable world. Pathrise matches you with a dedicated mentor in your field to provide tailored support throughout your job search journey. From optimizing your resume and application process to mastering your interview skills, their expert guidance prepares you to secure your dream job and to negotiate a competitive salary. The cherry on top is that you don't pay until you secure that high-paying job that you've been aiming for. Don't hesitate. Visit pathrise.com/KenG to get matched with an expert mentor today. This episode of Ken's Nearest Neighbors is brought to you by Z by HP, HP's high compute workstation-grade line of products and solutions. Z is specifically made for high-performance data science solutions, and I personally use the ZBook Studio and the Z8 workstation. I really love that the Z workstations can come standard with Linux or WSL2, and they can be configured with the Data Science Software Stack Manager. With the Software Stack Manager, you can get right to the work of doing data science on day one without the overhead of having to completely reconfigure your new machine. Now back to our show.
And I think the people who end up finding a lot of satisfaction in engineering and don't go back to data science particularly, or ML research, when, say, the infrastructure is better if they stick around long enough, which is not usually the case. I think I think it's the people who are really comfortable with ambiguity that stick around in data, or maybe they have more of a math background. I'm actually not sure about that. I feel like people of all sorts of backgrounds go between the two. It's really more of a mental perspective, just a comfort with, if I do this and it doesn't work, does it feel like I'm useless or something?
Yeah. And of course, there's no right or wrong in that.
No right or wrong,
it's just personal preference. And I have a lot of really good friends that they say, hey, data engineering, there's more certainty in that. That's more exciting for me.
Yeah, exactly.
I would argue I'm also looking for more certainty in things these days. I still prefer the data science because I find a lot of the engineering a bit more repetitive, but it doesn't have to be. I'm just working with a lot of the same data all the time, so it doesn't necessarily make sense for me to, there isn't novelty in the engineering that I do comparatively.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
But, so let's change gears a little bit. I'm interested, you quit your job, and then what are you doing now? Well, what does someone who's pretty far along in their career do when they take a break?
Yeah, so I'm starting something new. It's basically, I thought back on all the challenges I faced, especially in my last role, very, very specifically. And I wondered what I could have had at the time that might have prevented or helped me to foresee and solve some of those challenges that I faced. And I thought about it a little more meta. So for example, there was information I didn't have, or perspectives and knowledge I didn't have about maybe tactics on how to define ROI or how to manage a project X way or Y way, right? And I thought, well, maybe if I'd known that. But I didn't think that actually that was a good solution because at the time, no one was giving me negative feedback on what I was doing. And in fact, even after when stuff would go wrong, I would very rarely get negative feedback. They were just like, oh, you're doing great. You're smart. This is great work. Your team's very low drama compared to other projects, like it's not a quagmire. So what could I have done better? And I realized what I needed was someone to help point out my blind spots. Now, I think there are very few ways you can do that. You can get a coach. You could have a really good mentor in a company who will find your blind spots and raise you up. And even just one person like that is worth your whole career. Like you got one of that, that's enough. If they are observant and you meet with them regularly, but it's also kind of luck-based, very luck-based, right? So what I'm doing is I'm creating basically a mastermind group for data science leaders and senior technical contributors, like data science and related data roles, to basically meet regularly and talk about their biggest challenges with each other. And from the content of those groups, I would create courses, I think, that are unique because they're really getting at the big challenges that people face. So that's what I've been focused on. In the immediate weeks after I quit, I ended up doing a lot of like fixing up shit around the house. Stuff I'd been putting off for years. Like I bought a wine rack and I hadn't put it together and for at least a year. And so I actually put it together one afternoon. And it was such a satisfying feeling. I actually forgot what it felt like to do work where you get a feedback from like every millisecond. Like you hit the mallet or the hammer and you're like, wow, I can feel it and it goes in. It's so satisfying to complete physical things like that if it's not too challenging, right? And so it made me actually reflect, how can we create this kind of situation doing the kind of work that data scientists do in companies? How can we create those clear goals and immediate feedback that, stimulate the flow state that I've been experiencing a lot in the last couple of weeks?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people get into data science because there is, at least for me, there's some of that flow state. Mm-hmm. I don't really use them that much, but a Jupyter notebook and you run the cell and you're like, oh, the output's good. And then you run another cell and you're like, oh, I wonder if I made this tweak. And then you change some parameters and you're like, oh, okay, great. Or you're like, okay, well, I want to add these to the grid search and, oh, like the range on this parameter wasn't as good as I thought it was. Mm-hmm. You're like, maybe if we expand it, I might get better results. And you're just like waiting, you're anticipating, and you get the reward hit.
It's fun. That's the fun part.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's interesting because you do less of that when you manage. You do less of that when you're leading teams.
Yep.
And I could see some people who fall in love with that process and then go into leadership or do whatever because they're making more money, almost fall out of love with the career because the skill set and the things you focus on are so different. And I'm really fortunate because I get to still code. I get to do a lot of this stuff in my normal job, even though I lead a team. But I think a lot of people, they're like, well, is it good for my career or is it good for what I'm interested in? And they have to make this internal battle.
Mm-hmm. I interviewed someone, they accepted an offer, and then a week later they reneged. And I could have gotten mad, but I just messaged them directly, no HR. And I was like, hey, I was curious if you want to chat, I was just curious what happened. He was open to it when we talked, and it turns out that his company had taken a week, big company, slow, to one up our offer by promoting him to basically be a leader, small team. They were going to create some open positions for him in the month or two or something like that. So he, basically got the counter offer, and I was hiring a senior IC. And he said, you know what? The work I'm going to do here is going to be more boring than what I would have been doing with you probably. But this is a good move for my career. So I literally saw it play out. Yeah. What you just described. Yeah. It's kind of funny that I feel like leaders, data science leaders, anyone who gets promoted to management in technical roles, they get almost no training on how to actually lead people. Leading people, like the psychology and dynamics and whatever, even cross-cultural stuff. It's like really fascinating to me. Like studying how to lead and manage is its own reward. So I find that process intrinsically rewarding. But I feel like if you like data science and the process, the hands-on coding, it's kind of random. It feels almost like a crapshoot whether or not you'll actually also like the people side. There might be certain aspects. I've heard of people enjoying the delegation aspect, as in focusing more on thinking about on what to do rather than exactly how to do it. Finding the how slightly annoying to like get tangled. It's kind of tangled and messed up with. So then if you're like, okay, this is what's important, you then give it to someone else so they can figure it out. That could be rewarding for people. But generally, I think in leadership, one of the main challenges to feeling happy and enjoying it is that the conditions for the flow state don't exist to the same extent. You can have clear goals, but generally they're less clear than when you were in IC. Make the model better, write this code, do this package, okay, prod, deploy, whatever. When you're a leader, it's like, well, what should we be working on? How do I know I'm doing it well? No one knows the answers to these questions. You have to sort of define them jointly with everyone else. And that's the tough part. So the goals are less clear. The feedback is less immediate, as you said, because you can write code, you get results, and you keep going. That creates immediate feedback and can lead you into the flow state as you're exploring a problem. With the stuff you do in leadership, the feedback loop can be weeks, it can be months, sometimes it's years. That tends to apply more if you're running your own business or C-level or something like that. But the changes you do, you don't know if they're going to work or not. And there's not necessarily the perfect data to go on because the situation always changes. So there's less immediate feedback, which also can pull you out of flow. Sometimes the work can feel less meaningful because I think sometimes data scientists are drawn to it because it feels like you're wrangling a chaotic world with mathematics. You're bringing order to chaos. But when you're in leadership, often you're exposed to more chaos, and you're exposed to chaos that you cannot control. And I think deep down, a lot of data science leaders who are promoted from technical rather than being a leader of something else and then moving over or whatever, which I've seen a lot and it doesn't work very well. Those ones who get promoted from IC to manager, I find that they grapple with these sorts of things deep down.
Yeah. I also find, especially when I was working in larger companies and looking at office politics and those types of things, I think data people, that enraged me.
Yeah.
It's that, hey, we're supposed to be working as efficiently as possible. We want the best outcomes for our organization. Why do I have to talk to this guy and eat lunch with this person and do a favor for this person just to do what's best for this company in general? To me, there's so many little things like that I cannot stand. And, I work for a very small company now where that happens a lot less because I can just be like, hey, we're doing this.
Yeah.
But it's kind of disappointing in my mind that is such a big part of these things. And maybe some of the larger companies that are very tech focused cut that out a little bit better. I would argue they probably do, just because they have very specific infrastructure for that. But
Okay, I see that side you're getting at, but from what I've heard, a lot of people in big tech face just as many politics as they do because a lot of incentives are built to slow down change, or there's a lot of risk management, which is the word for stopping you from having fun. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I mean, it's funny though. You look at risk management now with it's risk management when it's convenient for them.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
Look at the advancements in AI. I mean, look at Google releasing Bard with ChatGPT, GPT-4, GPT-5 training. It seems like these companies are doing things that are somewhat risky.
Correct.
I personally think the Bard release they were not ready to release a lot of these things. And they're making these decisions that, again, are risky, but they have these procedures for employees that are...
When it's convenient.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's a great point. I never thought of it that way. That's very, what's the word? It's a dark view, but I like it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm more and more jaded as time goes with profit motivation in these types of things.
Yeah, sure.
We've talked a little bit offline. I talk with a lot of people that I think a lot of the AI stuff, it seems like we're moving unbelievably fast now. And this is obviously a review for you, but when Alan Turing made the Turing test, I think he assumed that we would solve it in a pretty short period of time, like 10, 20 years. And we took a lot longer for a system to essentially like not beat, but I guess beat the Turing test. And then and to that point, every projection we made about AI was way an overestimate. We're like, we're going to solve this quick. This is going to happen. The first AI meeting, they were like, we'll do it over, like a couple days and we'll figure this AI thing out. And I forgot who the researchers were. You have a lot better mind for those types of things. But throughout all of history until now, we've way overestimated our capability to solve artificial intelligence and to create it. And then now it's completely flipped and we're way underestimating the capabilities of it. And to me, whenever you have a shift from massive overestimation to underestimation in a very short period of time, that means decisions around a technology, especially capitalistic decisions around a technology, are very concerning because humans cannot process things that move at that speed. And I don't know what the implications are.
As the book Stolen Focus makes a point of, if you only, by Johan Hari, I think, if you're used to skimming information, then you'll view all the information in the world as being essentially just what matters is the surface. But in order to make really deep and interesting insights, you have to focus on one thing for long periods of time. If you treat the AI news now like every other news cycle where you're just skimming between headlines and not going in depth to try to understand the fundamentals of what's happening, I think you're at risk of also making very poor decisions that could have very bad long-term implications.
Yeah, I would agree. Do you think more companies than not are skimming or taking deep dives? Because I would imagine every large company I can think of is trying to integrate AI really aggressively right now.
Well, it depends. I feel like I think that it's fine when there's a human in the loop who can ultimately check it. And also, if the companies creating the AI systems have feedback loops with the users and with society, because it's that big now, about problems, citing facts, ethical decisions, that sort of thing. Like you always see viral content on, ChatGPT is sexist or racist. Look at, this little test I ran where we flipped the gender references and the pronoun, or something, and ChatGPT still assumed that the doctor was male and the nurse was female or something like that. And you're like, yeah, you can see that. But ultimately, if you have a feedback loop where you see that and then you can improve upon it, with different decisions in architecture or, I suppose, Band-Aids on top of current systems, then it's not so bad. Ultimately, I think the system is self-correcting. I want to hear a counterpoint, though.
So I would argue that there are things that are so useful that utility trumps the ethical border we have around
Yeah,
things.
definitely.
You look at probably most cell phones. There's some pieces in there where there's just human rights violations that are being done in order to get those parts. And we just don't think about it because we love our phones so much and the technology is so useful to us. I would imagine that these models to a point could be biased enough or dangerous enough or wrong enough, but they're still useful enough that we sort of sweep those other things under the rug. And, for example, for my use case, I'm like, oh, this helps me so much with my work and my coding. Like if it's wrong about a social issue or it gives a bad take or there's potentially dangerous stuff that could come out of it, as you know, even if it's some of my privacy, I'm like, you know, well, it's probably worth it to me because individually I get so much benefit from it. And that to me is scary, is that we're all looking out for what's best for us locally, our individual benefit from the product, that far outweighs the global danger that we feel, which is probably big and threatening for a lot of us.
That's true.
And I don't know how you reconcile those things.
Yeah, that's a tough one. The answer to reconciling, I think, I don't even know if humans are necessarily the best at figuring out what's best for them locally.
Probably
Maybe
not.
best for them locally in space and time. You know, I think we do things that are locally good and then bad with respect to the long term, right? Like we'll make short term decisions. And I feel like with AI, it could be beneficial in the short term. Is it net beneficial in the long term? Probably. I would say probably. It could be that I'm optimistic, but there's not really data to go on. I mean, you could look at how technology's advanced through history, and you could say that, well, if say military technology advances and it makes it easier to kill people, right? Was it a net good or net bad? Well, you could look at the correlation of rising wealth, total wealth and GDP in the world, and the rising pace of technology and stuff. And you're like, well, maybe that happened despite the weapons, or maybe it happened because it gave democracies, more or less like the US, the power to sort of enforce a kind of free markets in the world, which led to more trade. And, for example, the huge reduction in poverty in China over the last 40 years since they liberalized their economy. And countries like Vietnam, which did it just a little bit later in the 80s, those are like huge changes and huge benefits to people. Partly, ultimately, comes back to the threat of physical force if you don't play by those rules of trade, right? From mostly the U.S. It's there are other countries too, but mostly the U.S. So was it good or bad? Well, what it did is extend power, and ultimately, the good or bad partly depends on your perspective, how you measure it. I think AI will be the same, like any other technology. It will extend our powers. In a sense, if you think of it like a video game, when weapons advance, you become more like a glass cannon, meaning that people don't become more durable. The weapons just get better, and so people will become easier to kill. And that's compared to like the days of swords and armor and stuff, where you actually could be mostly impregnable to damage, right? So I feel like you don't enhance our ability to resist damage. You just enhance the power to do things. So you'll get like social media when that arose, and they put behavioral conditioning into the reward systems that made us more and more addicted to it, and we just sort of fell into it as a society. Now we're all like glued to our phones all the time. But it enabled so many good things.
Yeah.
Democratic uprisings, movements, coordination, all sorts of things. I think good and bad is a perspective thing. I think the real challenge is is if you think something is good, when the number of people in the world who agree with you start to shrink. If most people think that racist AI is bad, which they do, I'm pretty sure, then there will be people who will go into it to remove those things from the system, people studying ethical AI. So ultimately, I think unless the climate destroys us, climate change, then I think that it will ultimately be a net benefit, just like every other technology in the past.
Yeah. I mean, it depends who we're talking about, but I mean, I think a lot of people would also argue that social media is going to be a net benefit because it's all about the time horizon we look at it into. I mean, I look at 7-year-olds who are completely addicted to the phone already. And, they're, whether it's Instagram, whether it's any of these platforms, and we don't know the downstream effects. And that's kind of what you're saying as well, is like it is open-ended to whether these things have a net benefit. And what is a net benefit? Net benefit to humans? Net benefit to, I think AI has a massive positive net benefit to AI in the future. Right?
Yeah.
Like it's only going to get better.
Yep.
And what that all really means is that I know for a fact, I think the quality of human life and the way we live our lives day to day will change dramatically over the next probably 5 years as a result of AI.
I think so.
I don't know if that's good or bad, but I also personally think I have to be prepared for more downside solutions or more downside risk because there is so much possible variance, right? If it was like a fairly linear path and we said, okay, it's going to be kind of average, I don't feel like I'd have to plan as much for downside risk as I do if there's this massive, massive possible deviation of what could happen.
That's a good point. I mean, there are natural experiments in the world where there are giant, rapid shifts towards the negative. War is probably the most common example, where there was no war and then there was war. And you went from being able to go to the store to buy food to being a refugee, right? There was, Kosovo, Serbia 20-ish years ago. There's Ukraine, Russia now. That's, so you could look at those as case studies. What could they have, could someone, in Ukraine have gone off the grid and, had enough food storage for several years, in an underground bunker to survive the war? Maybe. The cost, though, to their life before the war might have been too much.
Yeah.
And the uncertainty of whether or not that would happen perhaps too great, right? So then do you abstract that away from individuals, and then the government should have, had these other preparations. But if you're ultimately being attacked, then what do you do about it,
I have very little faith in the government to handle a situation.
Yeah, fair enough.
I mean, realistically, we just COVID is still around, but we essentially went through this pandemic, and it was handled absolutely terribly by almost every government out there. If that happened again right now, we'd be even less equipped to handle it. Right?
Perhaps.
I mean, if you look at least the United States, right? I mean, you look at the United States, it's even more divided about if people would take a vaccine.
Right.
It could be a completely different disease, but there's so much of this like bifurcation sentiment that it'd be even worse than it was before the pandemic. And so I'm like, even in this scenario that we just went through, I don't think we're apt to handle it again.
I agree we're not apt to handle it. Yeah. It's hard to, for me, it's hard to say whether it'd be worse or better.
Yeah, that's also, it's the same argument, not argument, it's the same conversation we've been having.
Yes.
But again, it would be different, and there would be a lot of possible upside and downside. And I think the way I'm viewing the world is, before, when I was growing up, it seemed like there was very little, I don't know if you remember Bollinger Bands from finance. So like a Bollinger Band is essentially 2 standard deviations or 1 standard deviation of difference from like the stock trend. And it felt like the standard deviations on what was possible were pretty tight. It was like, okay, the world is heading in this direction. I'll do X, Y, Z, and whatever it might be. And with COVID, and then with the advancements in AI, we talked about climate change. We talked about a lot of things. I feel like those standard deviations have gone absolutely haywire. And I mean, that's like a mostly quantitative view. And and like, out of respect for people what they went through historically, like we haven't really had to deal with like major wars. I mean, there's Ukraine, Russia, but I would imagine that was a massive change of pace, and it shaped consumer behavior. I mean, I look at my mom, who went through some of the Great Depression, like just the very tail end of it. Her parents did. I see how her like consumer behavior is very different, and individual's behavior is very different. I wonder how that is going to shape the things that we're going through. Is going to shape how we are as adults, or how we raise our kids, or some of those types of things. But I'm not making a haywire case. I'm not going to put on a tinfoil hat yet, but it has made me think a lot from a fairly analytical perspective. How do you approach a future that is more uncertain than it was before?
Well, that ultimately comes back to your definition of a life well lived.
Yeah,
is the purpose of life to experience as little pain as possible? If it is, then maybe it makes sense to put a lot of resources into constraining your downside. And of course, it's easy for me to say that growing up in the U.S., right? You know, it's like everyone's like, "Dude, screw you, man. I have this and that and these problems, and my country was like this." I mean, my family came from Pakistan, and so they've only once transferred power peaceably from one democratically elected president to the next. There's an enormous amount of child poverty. There were the floods last year that buried a third of the country in water or something. That's crazy. So they're like, yes, I'd like some stability, you know. So I'm like sitting here and like in being interviewed, like, yeah, stability overrated. But I think ultimately, like you can, there is stability, and if you have a very stable situation, there will still be problems. And if you have a very unstable situation, there will still be problems. And I think if you were to at least have a discussion about what actually the kind of life you want to give, to the people, say, of a nation or something like that, that could ultimately lead to different conclusions about what to do. Is the purpose to give you maximal freedom of choice? Then you get consumerist, you get the U.S. approach, right? Is it to have maximal safety from downside? Then maybe we'd have a stronger safety net. Is it to encourage, bold, breathtaking explorations? Then you might do what the Polynesians did, where there were strong social incentives to basically strike out on your own and find new islands in Polynesia, right? So, I mean, different societies have different definitions of what a good life is. The ancient Greeks talked about heroism, and, or the Vikings in Valhalla, right? So they might look at our lives and think that they're not the things that we value are not the things that they value, right? There's a cultural side to this too, I think. Mm-hmm.
No, what is your version of a life well lived?
I don't know yet. I think there's something about feeling meaning and purpose. It's a life where you do something that you find valuable. And I think a life where you're able to affect the world in some way like that, even if it's just the world of your family and friends and local community. So I feel like having a purpose and defining and finding your own purpose is probably the closest answer I could come to, and then doing what it takes to fulfill that. Yeah.
How far are you from finding your purpose?
I don't know if I have a specific purpose yet. But definitely you can feel locally purposeful.
Yeah.
Goals can feel worthy, and you can just muster all your energy towards achieving it. Something, and then we can choose our own purposes, our own goals, something that, AI, I guess Auto GPT can do that, but not at the same level that we can. When an AI ends up coming up with goals that contradict each other, and ends up developing bad habits and behaviors that it wants to escape but cannot, like humans do, like addiction or something, then I'll be like, wow, we really come up with a human intelligence there, right? So like what weird ass collection of optimizations and goals are we programmed with in our brains that make us do all this crazy shit?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've talked about this offline a little bit, is that, at least right now, and to the best of my knowledge, AI or models can effectively only be trained with one objective function. Like you can, like unsupervised learning, train something to recognize patterns or whatever it might be. But if you're trying to do some form of supervised learning, and I guess ChatGPT is semi-supervised because they have the human loop. It's really only possible to create like a singular goal. And humans, as you just described, have these conflicting goals.
Yes.
Right? Like I might want freedom, but I also might want a girlfriend super bad or something like that. And it's like, well, man, we like those two things are actually like oppositional in some sense. Right? And I think that I don't know if that's an evolutionary thing, if that has benefited us in some way, or if that's detracted from our potential. But I think that the power of humans is that we're all kind of random.
Yeah.
We all have our individual...
And messy.
Yeah, messy. But humans just fall and they fall forward. Or historically. We'll see if we fall into what is it? Idiocracy.
Idiocracy.
I don't know if we're going.
It's a great movie.
That was a really good movie. I learned about. I was probably watching Instagram or something, and all of the characters in the movie they wear Crocs.
In Idiocracy.
Yeah, if you look in,
I was a kid and I probably didn't even know what a Croc was.
Well, so the dress designer, like the apparel designer for the movie, found them and they're like, oh, good, like, they're just super cheap. We can buy them in bulk. And one of the other people was like, okay, well, what if they become popular? And the designer was like, these are so ugly. How could they ever become popular? And now I probably wear Crocs all the time. Mm-hmm. So
that's hilarious. Oh yeah. We'll be watering our plants with Gatorade. Yeah, exactly. It's got electrolytes.
Exactly. Mm. Well, those are all the topics I wanted to cover. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Any other wisdom? Any recipes people should try?
Recipes. Well, cooking is awesome. I think you're one of the few friends I have who really likes to cook. Yeah, recently I've been getting into historical recipes. So I purchased a book. It's a translation. A transcreation is what she calls it, because she converts the units from historical units that, like, what does this mean, to modern kilograms and teaspoons and stuff. But
it's not 6 mouthfuls of rice and
6 whatevers of this or that. Yeah. At least this thing had measurements, because in the old days, like, no one put measurements in their recipes. It'd be like, throw the leeks and the stock in the pot and cook as I told you. And you're like, well, that doesn't mean tell me anything. Yeah, but it's a translation of this cookbook from the time of the Mughals in India, from the time of Shah Jahan, so probably like 450 to 500 years old. I cooked a recipe for it for Eid for my family recently, and it was really popular. This is very fancy, where you cook lamb with a little bit of spices, like minced lamb, and then you stuff it in a chicken, and then you create a bed of cinnamon in a pot. You pour ghee around it, and you like cover the chicken with like yogurt and saffron, and then you steam it. And it said steam for 4 hours, and that was way too long, because I guess chickens back then were made of iron. But so it was steaming for 1 hour is probably enough, and you open it, it's like tastes like God. It's amazing.
That does sound really good.
Yeah. So I was very curious, because my family says they make Mughlai style cooking, like the royal Muslim court, back then. And I was curious. I guess it's in a way a data driven way. Like, do we actually? So I wanted to see what real recipes from the time look like and compare it to my family's style. And I found generally that our stuff is pretty close. Our stuff's a little spicier today, and there's more ingredients, but some of our stuff is a little simplified from like the crazy number of steps that they would do back then.
Yeah. Well, yeah. We have air fryers, Instapot.
Yeah, we have more tools as well. But then what's interesting is that you look at, they use a lot of they use techniques that we don't use anymore. They have categories of food that we don't have anymore in modern Indian Pakistani cooking, at least that I'm aware of. So some of these things sort of like just kind of died out. And there are different concepts. And when you cook a lot, maybe you relate. If you want to come up with recipes, or you want to come up with interesting fusions of different cuisines, then what you have to do is the way I do it is I analytically break down the purpose of different ingredients, and then I can mix and match them. Like, soy sauce and fish sauce, they're both umami rich, like, liquids that I can use to add a savory flavor. Or tomatoes and Parmesan cheese, do something similar, but tomatoes have acid. You break down the analytical categories, and then you can go, whoop, whoop, whoop,
have you read
mess it with it.
The book Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat?
Yes.
So that's a great book. That's a great framework. Is that
Mm-hmm.
okay? Basically, every good food has some element of all 4 of these things.
Mm-hmm.
So it has to have the right amount of salt. It has to have some form of acid. It has to have some fat content. And then there's a bunch of different ways that you cook it to bring out the best in the combination that you've created. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very data-driven approach.
Super cool.
I love the book. I absolutely hated the Netflix show.
Oh yeah? I thought it was good. I didn't mind the Netflix show.
Yeah. It wasn't my favorite. But the book was a lot more it felt more scientific than the show did for me.
Fair enough. Yeah, that book changed the way I looked at cooking, and it gave me, I'd always wanted to be analytical about it. For example, my family, they make their own garam masala. It means warm spices. It's just like the classic like spice collection used in, we'll see, I guess, North Indian cooking and Pakistani cooking, and every family does it differently. And so, you get the recipes handed down and it's like 9 spices. I'm like, why these 9 and why in these ratios and what was the point? And it's only when you go into each spice individually and you like smell them, you taste them, you look at them and you think, what does this relate to? So I almost think of cooking knowledge or knowledge of anything as like a graph. For example, cardamom is like kind of sweet but also spicy, and so therefore it can go with these things but not with these other things. So maybe you like mellow out with milk, and then you get cardamom flavored ice creams and stuff, and you're like, wow, why does this work so well? Cinnamon is similar. It's like sweet and kind of spicy. Coriander seed, on the other hand, smells like lemon zest to me.
Well, you know what you would love? You haven't gotten into bread making at all, I assume.
My wife did, but it's not like we do it very often.
So I read another book called Flour, Water, Salt, Yeast, and he talks a lot of, it's all about bread. But bread, you have another factor, which is time and temperature. Well, 2 other factors, time and temperature. So yeast is a living thing.
Yes.
And in order to get the correct texture and a lot of these things out of the bread, you have to, it's literally a function of time and the temperature in the room to get the yeast to the correct proofing point. So it's a very, very, a lot of people look at it as an artistic task. I look at it as a very scientific task. Like I can literally, if I did enough experiments, plot the optimal time I would need based on the temperature in the room and the humidity and some of these other things. And that to me is fun. But I also, cooking to me is very much an art because I'm so very scientific about everything else that I do that it's a nice outlet to be able to exercise that. And honestly, I love pretty much everything that is both truly an art and a science, including data science. Right? There's a lot of artistry and the storytelling and stuff around that. There's
a lot that they share in common. If you want to quickly learn new concepts in data science, then it's faster if you connect it to things you already know. Almost in a graphical way. Like, oh, I know this, and then the flaws of this technique are that, so therefore they made this innovation which does this thing differently, and therefore, whatever. And then if you do that, you'll have this sort of graph in your head about how everything's connected together, and then you can make substitutions, or find the parallels between different techniques, like any type of Bayesian optimization that's done in a sort of a loop, like a stepwise fashion, and you might relate it to something like gradient descent. You're like, well, these techniques are not that different, But yeah, that's the fun part. So it's like mixing and matching in cooking and mixing and matching in data science and concepts. And then it lets you feel like you're an artist, even when you're doing something really sciencey and supposedly quite objective.
Yeah, I think that might be a discovery for me today, is that I really love things that have both of those elements. I mean, everything that I really enjoy doing right now, podcasting, YouTube, jiu-jitsu, cooking, all of those things have probably equal ratio. Oh, and obviously data science of the art and the science. And maybe you could make an argument that everything has those equal elements, but I would imagine that, I never really fancied myself much of an artist, but maybe I am more than I think.
Yep. You probably are. Yeah. The best parts of data science are when you're using scientific techniques, but combining them in an artful manner. Yeah. And the art is often in the execution. The art is, how do I do it in this amount of time? How do I do it in a way that's explainable? That's like the stuff that there's not necessarily a defined answer. Even, if you choose among 60 time series cross-validation procedures, you might say, oh, well, train, test, split, obviously. It's like facts. That's how you do it. You can't have leakage of data, when fitting a model and then assessing its performance. But then if you get into time series, you realize that there's many different ways to not have leakage and which one tends to generalize the best. There was one of my favorite papers went into this topic, and the answer was they had to empirically test, like having a train a gap period and then test making the gap larger and shorter, randomizing, having train tests next to each other, but randomizing where it happens, like that split in time, and all sorts of things, and they used a bunch of data sets and like, which one works the best? And I implemented, and then I had to basically hand implement the procedure that they said generalized the best. Did that in my last job. It was that was a lot of fun. So I always thought, like, there is an art to it too. There's an art even to implementing the science. Yes. There's an art to running good experiments. The experiment, you can assess it in a scientific way, but to come up with the experiment, there's an art to that. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I think that's a good thing to end on. Where can people learn more about you? Where can people potentially reach out to you if they're interested in learning more?
Well, my LinkedIn profile is my main way. So Richad Nieves-Becker. Yeah. Excellent. I haven't put up my site yet or documents or anything. I got to get on that.
Okay. I will link everything that Richad has in the description below. Thank you so much again for the time.
Yeah.
This was amazing.
It's awesome chatting.
Yeah, absolutely.